I'm Daniel Schwake, the director of Notre Dame's Academic Center in Jerusalem, and you're listening to Jerusalem Talks. In this episode, Avraham Burg sits down with Dr. Karma Ben Johanan, historian of Jewish-Christian relations and a faculty member at Hebrew University's Department of Comparative Religion. Together, they discuss how Ben Johanan's personal biography shaped her interest in religion and Jewish-Christian relations. She explores the evolving post-Holocaust Catholic-Jewish dialogue rooted in the 1965 Nostra Aetate declaration, noting both theological breakthroughs and enduring tensions, especially around issues of particularism, universalism, and global relevance of this reconciliation. They also explore the challenges and transformations in Jewish-Christian relations, as well as the role of geography and the local politics on how interfaith dialogue takes place.
Peace on you, Dr. Karma Ben Johanan.
Peace on you, Avrum.
You're an historian of Christian theology, an Israeli, born Jewish. You had the chair of the Jewish-Christian relationship at the Faculty of Theology at the Humboldt University of Berlin. And today you are the Comparative Religion Department at the Hebrew U in Jerusalem, right?
Yes, absolutely. Not only that I was born Jewish, I still am.
Till the end of the program at least, okay? So tell me something. I mean, you were born in Haifa. People do not know what is Haifa, but let me define it, okay? Haifa, in a way, is such a beautiful city because neither Moses, nor Jesus, nor Muhammad ever set a foot there. So it's maybe the most unreligious, non-religious city of Israel, right?
Yes.
So what led a good Jewish Israeli girl to this kind of field?
Yeah, good question. And interesting that you started with Haifa, because indeed the beauty of Israeli secularism is definitely there. Yes, absolutely. But there is also a Haredi quarter in Haifa.
Ultra-Orthodox.
Ultra-Orthodox, exactly. And very early in my life, my father decided that he belongs to that quarter. And so I lived somehow in between the worlds. So my interest in religion, like I think everybody else, really emerges from my own biography. So this is where it started. I knew also the other Haifa, so to say.
So which means in a way, within the Jewish sphere of identities, you are bi-identical.
I don't know, non-binary identical,
Non-binary,
I would say.
okay. It's too sensitive. Let's drop it. Let's move on, okay? But you really invested a lot into this set of relationship, which, yes, I can say I understand how it comes from a place like Haifa, because there are Jews and Muslims and Christians live alongside in maybe the most normal way possible. And therefore, it's not something strange like, for example, in Jerusalem. I grew up in Jerusalem, but Christianity was something dark, threatening. So how do you feel the move from Haifa to Jerusalem vis-a-vis this, the existence?
I would say that the older I get, the more I like Haifa, but still Jerusalem, I find it still to be the most interesting place in the world. So this
in what sense?
In defense of Jerusalem. In the sense that the tensions are very obvious, very
you see
on
them.
The surface there.
Sure.
You see them, you can sense them in ways that in other places you don't. And this is, of course, very hard, but there's something very real in it. And I like the relationship with the real. So in this sense, I think Jerusalem is for me. But I would say that in terms of my scholarly biography, I started with learning, let's say, late antiquity, Christian theology in late antiquity. And only then I realized that actually, religion is actually still alive. And also Christianity is still alive.
And still ancient.
And still ancient, well, it depends how you look at it. But because in Tel Aviv University, usually when we learned Christianity, it was basically much more historical. So the Middle Ages or maybe the latest period we got. And then I realized that actually, things are still happening within Christianity also today. And then I decided to make the leap and to study contemporary stuff in the 20th century. And I don't regret it still.
You write a lot, and we shall talk about your writing and your work. But one of the books you wrote, called in Hebrew, For a Stew of Lentil, in English it is
Jacob's younger brother,
which is the Redeemer, Jesus Christ.
There is no, of course, younger brother,
But then the subtitle is fantastic, and this is Mutual Perceptions of Jews and Christians in the Era of Reconciliation. This is the quantum leap you described earlier. Can we agree that the turning point between the era of conflict to the era of reconciliation is the Nostra Aetate of 1965?
I would say that this is how we usually consider it, not only in the scholarly discourse, but also in public discourse, because this is the first time we have a declaration with such gravity that attempts to revisit the Christian theology of Jews and Judaism. And this, of course, had influence beyond the Catholic Church. It's an ecumenical influence, which is quite obvious. And then, because of the gravity of this declaration, the common opinion was that indeed the end of polemic between Jews and Christians, which was a very long period in history, most of Jewish Christian history was very polemical, even though not only, of course, that something changed to the point that we should really speak about a transition, a 180 degrees transition.
So let's take this 65 as the turning point, at least for the sake of the discussion. And when we say Nostra Aetate, if I want to translate it into contemporary language, I would say it's something like, what's up?
What's up?
Okay,
yeah.
What's going on? What's the situation in
Right.
our time?
Yeah, exactly.
So I will ask you, this reconciliation, this post-polemic dialogue between Jews and Christians, what's up? What's going on? Where are we now, 60 years later?
Yeah, exactly. That's also the question that was interesting to me when I thought about this age of reconciliation. And I think what is up is that when we look beneath the surface, we see that many of the tensions are still there. It doesn't mean that there wasn't a change. I think there was a very significant change. But we're talking about religions, about religious traditions, and the baggage never disappears in any religious tradition. It comes with you and it moves and it changes, but it doesn't go away. And therefore, maybe speaking about these eras in such a rigid way does not do justice with the delicate aspects, the nuances that are characteristic of this very extremely complex relationship between Jews and Christians. And this is what the book tries to surface. And I think actually now the Hebrew book came out in 2020 and the English in 2022, and now we're 2025. And I think it's even more obvious. So the tensions become ever more present.
Let's map it slowly. Later on, I will argue through a question that there is no one Jewish realm. There are few, and therefore there are few reactions. I will ask you, is there one Christian one, or global South and global North are different? Western world democracies, Christianity is one thing, and Latin America is a different thing. Far East, is it the same as the West? So give me the landscape of who's talking with whom.
Yeah, excellent question. So when we think about the council, when we think about Nostra Aetate, first of all, we think about Catholics who are talking mainly to Catholics, right? This is something that it's intra-Catholic. Moreover,
though in 65, the most surprising element was the invitation for both non-Catholic churches and later on the opening of a dialogue with non-Christians.
Absolutely. But this is like a Catholic...
But the thing itself was a Catholic council.
Exactly. It's the Catholic Church that is now deciding to open itself to dialogue with non-Catholic Christian denominations, with other religions, with the secular world, right? But this is still mostly an intra-Catholic discussion. Moreover, we're still, even though we have already processes of decolonization going on in the world, this is still a very Eurocentric church. And this is very important.
Eurocentric church only, or Eurocentric dialogue?
But that's the implication.
Okay.
Certainly, that's the implication, because we have what we have in the background of Nostra Aetate, specifically. We have other things in the background of other declarations, of course, but we have the Shoah, we have the Holocaust there in terms of the burden on...
It's too early in the conversation. I mean, the Holocaust is such a heavy stone. Let's wait for it. for
Yeah, but it doesn't wait.
okay,
I mean, you can't
okay, it is
understand
there.
Nostra Aetate without it, I
Good.
think, because this is also a point where the Catholic Church starts to be criticized for the pontificate of Pope Pius XII. Still, the Pius Wars over his pontificate are still going on, and this really starts during the council. So we have this coping in the background. We also have this, maybe this is too early for the state of Israel as well, but
Yeah.
but we also have that entity which causes a lot of
Let me
controversy.
open a box here. The First Vatican Council was the middle of the 19th century, and the church, like the church, is strategic slow cooker. So the second one was 100 years later. So we have to wait 40 more years for the third one. But in the middle of the 60s, you face the following things. Post two world wars, one is saturated with atrocities. The entire Europe is traumatized and post-traumatized. The pill, so the status of the woman in the society and in the family is different. The state of Israel, and all of a sudden, hey, what's going on here? The entire Augustinus theology is challenged by the successful state of Israel. The Cold War, and maybe the most emotional, troubling element is, yes, you can say the Nazis were German pagans, but the Holocaust happened in the midst of Christian Europe. So there was the theology of guilt as well. So these are the circumstances that gave birth to this courageous move. Now, I asked you earlier, is it just a Eurocentric, or the other engaged, like North American, Latin American, African, Global South, etc., in the dialogue?
So I think this is the most central question that overshadows Jewish Catholic dialogue today. Really the question whether this is something that pertains to the universal church, or rather this remains something that is Western in its core. Is the Jewish question a European question? Is anti-Semitism a European thing, or does it have roots or some kind of a background, an ancestor within Christianity in general? And therefore, this is also something that should be transplanted in global Christianity, not only in the Eurocentric or North American centric context. And now there is a lot of tension around that question. And you mentioned South America. We can mention also Africa and Asia. And of course, they have their own past full of atrocities of different kinds. And we often see some kind of a competition between the burden of colonialism, the memory of colonialism, and the memory of the Holocaust. And this competition, this tension, is something that we feel in the global discourse. We feel it also in the West. Of course, we feel it here in Israel, in Palestine. It's very prominent. But this really is a global issue, whether it is possible to reconcile these two sensibilities, these two bodies of memory, and work with them together, or there is basically a clash and one has to prioritize something.
If we speak about this dimension of theology of guilt or theology of responsibility, is there not enough room for both? Why should it be a binary this or that, 1 or 0? Why not both?
Well, that's a sensitive question. I can think about many possible trajectories on how to answer that. But let's take, for example, there is the question of the particularity of Judaism, of Jewishness to the Christian story. We have the Jewish background, the Jewish upbringing, the Jewishness of Jesus in general, right? And today it's not only the carnal issue, right? It's not only in the body that Jesus was Jewish, but we also think of him as Jewish in terms of his sensibilities, of his cultural background, etc. And on the other hand, so the Jewish-Christian relationship very much anchors itself and its reconciliation in this historical particularity that cannot be compared with anything else. However, when we think about the opening of the church to the global south, then we see all kinds of theologies which are much more contextual theologies that emphasize the rootedness of the story of Jesus in various contexts, right? This is actually a universal, or there are many particularisms
So
that
Jesus,
could be.
the universal, is applicable or talks or represents many human sufferings. Jesus, the Jew, is a different story because it's the very foundation of the theology. So what do we make room for his Jewish identity, or we just skip over to the Paulus and on after of Christianity? That's the question.
Exactly. And look how interesting it is, because in a way, it's really an incarnation, and sorry for using that word specifically.
No, it's fine.
But it's an incarnation of a very old tension between, Jewish particularism, what we often called, and Christian universalism. And there was always a tension. On the one hand, Christianity always respected the particularism of Judaism, of Jewishness, but it also always had a very hard time with it. So there's always an intra-Christian tension around that, and you see it reconfigures differently in many Christian contexts. And I think this is something that is also burdening the dialogue today in terms of what to do with this Jewish particularism if we want to give room to Christianities that are not rooted in this very complex Jewish Christian history in the West, that are far away, that are also looking for ways to anchor themselves in very different histories. And here we see the difficulty. So it's not only the Holocaust, in a way, it's also a theological issue.
Here, I know it's a little bit of a side road, but let's take it and come back to the highway in a second. Vis-a-vis all the components you just put on the table, I find what you write about and his position of Benedictus XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, may he rest in peace, fascinating, in a sense that at the beginning he supported the Nostra Aetate from a very liberal, Christian liberal point of view. Then he left this position and became more and more and more conservative about it. And therefore, a German Pope with a theology and their attitude toward the Jews in general, the very specific one Jew in particular, Jesus Christ, his position was fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about him?
Yeah, I would love that. I also wrote about him in other contexts. So this is actually, it combines very well, because one of the things that are so interesting about Ratzinger is also the way he thinks about secularism and the connection between his thought
the
about
conversation
secularism.
between him and Habermas.
Exactly.
The little I understood, okay,
Yeah,
it's a
really
fascinating way.
Absolutely. But he's also a good example, because the way I see it, what was interesting for Ratzinger, if we talk about John Paul II, Ratzinger was, of course, his right hand, but John Paul II was interested in Jews and Judaism also because of a very close relationship with Jews.
During his upbringing in Poland.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for Ratzinger, you see that his interest in Judaism emerges from his Catholicity. In a way, it has to be central, because this is part of Christian history, it's part of Christian culture, and it's part of Christian identity. And therefore, what he tried to do, in my view, is to root the Catholic theology of Jews and Judaism within Catholic theology writ large.
To root and contain, not to ignore and not to depart from.
Exactly. So and the most interesting thing in Ratzinger, and this is something that I learned from Christoph Schmidt and also developed a bit in my own work, is that when we think about supersessionism, right, this idea that the church replaced Israel, what Ratzinger does is to speak about continuity between Judaism and Christianity.
Which is evolution, not a revolution, not break away, but a kind of a spectrum.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He would call it reform and not revolution, in a way. And this is also the way he sees the relationship between secularism, secular enlightenment, and Christianity. So we have a culture that is still very rooted in its origins, whether it's the Jewish origins of Christianity or the Christian origins of secular Europe, right? So this is the parallel here, which he's doing, and I think it's really fascinating. And therefore, there's something, he wants to maintain the uniqueness of Judaism and the uniqueness of Catholicism, and also the uniqueness of secular enlightenment. This is the heart of his discussion with Habermas as well, but also to see some kind of a relationship between them that allows this uniqueness but does not lose.
Which allows the critical thinking of enlightenment within Christianity and offer the compassion of religion to the non-believer.
For Ratzinger, Christianity is full of rationality itself. So he wouldn't go with you in the sense that what Christianity has to offer is only this compassion. Of course, it has to offer compassion, but it also offers the logos, right?
Yeah,
It also
the logic.
exactly reason,
The reason, the law, the order, the structure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Judaism offers the law, right? The commandments, the moral edict. So it's there. But this also means that everybody is allowed and even should criticize each other. So there should be kind of a reasonable criticism of religion.
So let's come back to the highway, because I'm really attracted or seduced to go on, because maybe we'll visit it later, but as logical and structured the philosopher in Ratzinger came Pope Benedict, and he left theology and moved into leadership of gestures.
Ratzinger?
No, Franciscus.
Francis, of course.
Okay,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
okay. I do this. Don't talk to me the philosophy. Let me go to the place. Let me express myself. So it's interesting, the kind of leadership, and we don't know about the new one, the Leo popeship, but let's see where it goes. Okay, we understand what drove the Christians of the time, of the last century. And up until today, we understand it's an issue. Blessed by some, not fully accepted by others. Fine, for whatever reasons. What was the response of the Jewish world to this Catholic hand extension? I mean, it was the first time they offer us a hand of peace, Yad Leshalom. So
Right.
what was the reaction of the Jewish world, assuming there is a Jewish world? There is no one.
Exactly. So you started by highlighting that there is no one Catholic world, right? And this is absolutely true, but it's even more true for the Jewish world that doesn't even have one pope.
No, we have two chief rabbis. We are better than that. Okay, we have two popes. Okay.
Yeah, and none of them is really respected within
and nobody
the
listens to
Jewish
them.
world.
That's right.
So it's very, very complicated. In a way, it's more parallel to the Protestant world, the way the Jewish world behaves in terms of its internal division. So there is no one response, and it also doesn't correspond directly to Nostra Aetate or to the 1960s. It corresponds to many events and to many different contexts. I would say that first, there was a lot of suspicion whether this is really serious, this change, whether Christianity is able to change its relation to Jews and Judaism, or rather the hostility towards Judaism is rooted so deeply within Christianity that it's simply impossible, and therefore it should be understood as something that is quite superficial. So there was that atmosphere in more conservative, I would say, Jewish camps. Liberal Jews like Avraham Yoshua Heschel, for example, were more open to get engaged and involved in dialogue. And by the year 2000, we also had some liberal Jewish declarations that really accept the hand that is reached out by the Christian world. So we have that. And this is mostly, I would say, in the United States, this is where the dialogue...
Let's dig deeper. You make a distinction in your writing that most of the positive reaction to set up the dialogue and do the dialogue was American Jewry, and in Israel, much less. So let's divide this into two segments. What happens in American Jewry, and who are the players? What happens in Israeli Jewry, and why? In American Jewry, you mentioned few names, but can you characterize them without the names, just the trends, the movements, the ideologies of American Jewry, who moved for it?
Yes, absolutely. I would just add that, of course, in Europe, there is also dialogue. There were just much less Jews, for obvious reasons. So let's focus on the Jewish centers in Israel and the United States.
Let's say that as for now, unlike before the Second World War, 80% of the Jews are living between North America and Israel, which was not the case up until the Holocaust. So this is the center of gravitas in many senses.
Yes, absolutely.
Go on.
And first of all, the need to be more open to dialogue is much more concrete. It's much more in everyday life in the United States because Jews are living among Christians. It's very obvious and clear. And they also experience their lives as a minority, right? Which is a completely different way than how we in Israel experience our lives. I mean, it's really existentially different. And that's important. Many of us don't know Christians at all. Or if we know
Many of
Christians,
us Israelis.
of course. And if we know Christians, we don't always know that they're Christians, right? So there is that issue. So in America, we had, I would say, of course, this could be complicated more and maybe should be, but I will try to divide, for the sake of the discussion, the main trajectories to two groups. So one would be the more hesitant approach or attitude that was following quite curiously the processes within the Catholic Church, but preferred to conduct this new relationship on secular terms and not to get into theological entanglements, not to speak about the painful theological issues, the Messiah, the covenant, all kinds of things that were very heavy.
Monotheism versus Trinity.
Exactly. So all of this was kind of marginalized within this trend within Orthodoxy. Soloveitchik would be the main figure here. I think in these groups, this actually changes recently. So there is more openness to dialogue within the modern Orthodox world in the United States than there was in the 1960s.
And the other group in the 60s?
And so the other group would be, if we think about Heschel as one of the main voices that supported dialogue. So his idea was, first of all, that we have now secularism, which is kind of a new, friend, enemy, however you want to look at it, a new reality. And therefore, this changes also the relationship. So in his essay, No Religion is an Island, he's saying we're in dialogue actually anyway. We can't allow ourselves to be secluded, and therefore, of course, we have to maintain some boundaries. Jews are always...
You surprise me, because I have the impression through my own experience and the impression through reading you that there were actually three kinds of reactions. The ultra-Orthodoxy that say no, and that's it. You mentioned names like Moshe Feinstein and other, no. Then there were two reactions that the more modern people. On one hand, Soloveitchik, which was the greatest leader and theologist and philosopher of modern Orthodoxy in America, who said no but, and Avraham Yoshua Heschel, who said yes with no but. So there were actually three kinds of reactions.
If you read Heschel carefully, there are also some buts there.
Yeah, but this kind of buts that you say for the sake of saying. But let's move onwards. The impression I have before we move to Israel is that somehow the Catholic preferred to dialogue with Orthodox Jews rather than with the 80% of the non-Orthodox in North America, which are the cohort, the power. So what is it, this preference of orthodoxy?
Yes. Well, that's a good question. First of all, there is this, spontaneous, non-scientific division that in a way Orthodoxy is more similar to Catholicism and liberal Judaism is more similar to Protestantism. And therefore the natural partner, so to say, would be Orthodoxy. That's one thing. And the second thing is that they are considered, which is of course a mistake, but the Orthodoxy is often considered as more traditional, as more in line with what happened before modernity, right? As non-modern Judaism. And therefore, if you want to go back to the Jewish roots of Christianity and to the way Jesus thought about the Torah and the commandments, you want people that are observing these same commandments throughout history. And the Orthodox are considered to be those who represent this continuity.
I don't want to go into this argument within Judaism, who is more authentic, because Orthodoxy is also a reaction to modernity. But let's leave it aside. What surprised me in this revelation that they prefer Orthodoxy is that Orthodoxy, the way I know it, and I grew up into it, is completely non-theological. It's a very practical one. What time you turn on the light, you turn off the light, how deep should the holy bath be, what kind of a blessing you say about this, about that. Very little theology, if at all, in our system. And this entire Nostra Aetate is so much saturated with theology. So how you build a bridge between the two psyches?
Exactly. And this is already one of the big obstacles, right? Language somehow. I mean, we're talking about different languages in which language they're supposed to speak with each other. If the religiosity is structured so differently in terms of the interests, in terms of everything, basically. But just before we develop this, I would just like to say that there is another aspect that connects maybe between the communities. And this is, for example, the place of women in both of them, right? So both have this very patriarchal.
You mean no place, less place.
I meant to put it more
The structure,
mildly, but
the structure is much more masculine-centered and patriarchal.
exactly. And in this sense, it is more conservative,
Yeah.
right? There is something that
The
that
establishment, the norms, the role of, etc.
the family, the structure of the family,
Sure.
etc. So these are things in terms of the difficulties with all kinds of aspects of modernity are sometimes similar. And this is kind of a common ground that does connect, that really connects between the communities. However, like you mentioned, Orthodoxy's interests are very, very different. This is a different world and sometimes a very closed world. So when we think about modern Orthodoxy in the United States, then we have a group that is really open to modernity and tries to maneuver or to navigate this very difficult space between tradition and modernity. But when we think about other Orthodox and especially ultra-Orthodox communities, this is much harder, right? Because we're talking about communities that are really trying...
Self-ghettoized.
Yeah, right. That want to separate themselves, not only from the non-Jewish world, but also from the rest of the Jewish world.
So let's stay in North America for one more second and then come back to Israel or travel to Israel. What is the nature of this dialogue? Is that a minimal dialogue or maximal dialogue?
In terms of ultra-Orthodoxy?
Whomever sits around the table, the American Jews you mentioned and others who are involved and whomever, you sit around the table. Be it in Rome, be it wherever it is. Minimal dialogue means, nice meeting you. What do you think about this? Okay, I think about that. See you next time. Don't call me, I'll call you. Maximal dialogue says, I'm open. I want to hear your opinion. And if I accept them, I will adopt them. So is it about an exchange of opinion or just exposure of opinion? What is the depth of the dialogue? How ready the sides are to really have a true exchange?
So I'll give a complex answer, and I'll say that in very small circles, there is really deep dialogue, but these circles remain very small and very professional in a sense.
And less influential?
And sometimes less influential. So it really, the bishop, for example, in some community, so he knows in general some things about Judaism, about the change, right? About the need not to read scriptures in a certain way that will surface Christian anti-Judaism. So he will know how to be careful in terms of being in touch with the Jewish community. But very seldom he would know more than that, right? It's not going to be something that is very prominent on his agenda. Of course, there are exceptional cases, for sure. But I would say that today this is the case. It wasn't always the case. So there were periods where the relationship with Judaism was even more prominent and important, and it kind of touched bigger circles. Also, of course, in liberal Catholicism, when we're talking about the 60s, the 70s, even the 80s, then we have, so to be a liberal Catholic means also to engage with Jews. It's very important. Today, this is no longer the case.
But again, engage in a conversation. You and me sitting, and you tell me, Avraham, I'm for whatever. And I say, yeah, tell me more about it. And then I go back home and say, wow, I want to do what she told me. I mean, I really accept what you tell me about nutrition, about faith, about good book, about good behavior. Or I can say she lives on her own. I respect it. It's fine. Not for me. So when I go in, even these small circles, the most intensive, the most sincere one, is there a chance that one day the bishop will convert into Judaism or a rabbi will convert into Christianity because of this exchange?
No, actually, the contrary, which is also a change, right? Because one of the major things that Catholics have learned from the conversations with Jews is that Jews cannot stand mission. That the most insulting thing for a Jew is that you want to convert him. right? This was very much on the agenda of dialogue, and it took decades until in 2015 there is an official church declaration from the Committee for Religious Relations with the Jews that states that there is no institutional mission to Jews. So that was actually an exchange that led to a very significant transition within Catholicism. Okay, we can talk about the significance and how profound this is, and there is still discussion about mission. I mean, it's not that it ended the story completely, but this is actually something. I think Catholics were very open to listen to Jews state their minds about mission, for example. That was clearly the case. I'm wondering if we can say something similar about Jews in terms of a transition. Again, we have the problem here that it's not clear. We don't have an official Jewish voice ever, right? So again, we have individuals that look much more positively on Christianity than before, but it's hard to find a parallel in terms of the gravity of such a change within the Jewish world, which is definitely a problem of asymmetry, which is very hard to solve.
Let's travel over the ocean and land at the Holy Land, okay? How was the opening of a dialogue or the suggestion for a dialogue accepted by Israeli Jewry, if at all?
So here it's much more difficult. One reason is that there is less coexistence, right? We feel less the presence of Christians. Second is the challenge of Jewish sovereignty is huge. Jews don't know, they don't have a historical precedent, and they're learning in the very hard way, hard for themselves and for others, how to be a majority. And Christianity is like the historical and mythical other that signified hegemony, that signified the majority, the oppressive majority. And therefore, in a sense, this is kind of the negative, the mirror through which Jews are trying to understand their own power sometimes, or to imagine themselves vis-a-vis Christianity. So we have much more an imagined Christian other than a real Christian other.
Which in a way corresponds with what you said about Christians imagine authentic Judaism and Orthodoxy. Israeli Jews imagine authentic Christianity as Middle Ages crusades, pogroms, you name it.
Great, absolutely. It's very similar in this sense. There is something mythical there, this search of authenticity that doesn't really meet reality in the strong sense. Maybe it's also worthwhile to mention that also, the state of Israel and Zionism has been a very difficult issue for the church right from 48, actually for much older times in different variations, but we can get to that or not. However, this is something that burdens also the relationship. And for Israeli Jews, it has always been very important that Israel was an important part of their Jewish identity very often. At least when we speak about Zionist sectors of society, the Zionism in the broader sense. And there is also no knowledge of the changes that are taking place in the Christian side, right? For Catholics, they feel it's much easier for them to speak with Europeans and North Americans because the common ground is much clearer. And therefore, Israelis are out of the dialogue, and therefore Israelis don't know what is going on in the dialogue. And Jewish identity in Israel is growing or developing in a certain way, and these trajectories just don't meet.
As seducing as it is to go to the whole theology of the successful of the state of Israel in the eyes of Christianity, what does that mean with the God blessing? Was it removed again or was given to the old church, to the old? Okay, leave it aside. I mean, I love to go there, but not now. I like to explore something which is very, very painful. When you read the papers, when you walk the streets, especially of your beloved Jerusalem, you see that the behavior of many individuals toward whomever symbolically represents Christianity, going with the outfit or go out of a church or the monastery or whatever it is, even pilgrims coming in groups is harassing, is violent, is very, the language and the attitude, and sometimes even physical. It's reported, not well covered, but reported. So my question is it possible that the very establishment of the State of Israel and the fact that we are the majority who is not really sensitive to any minority. We're simply a majoritarian society. Released all the genies from all the bottles, and therefore the state of Israel is in a way a permission to take a revenge against the entire history of persecution that we had with the Christians?
So I wouldn't go that far with revenge, but I'll go halfway with you.
Retaliate, react.
I would say that first of all, there is freedom of expression that had no parallel within Jewish history in Christendom. At least when we're talking, there are precedents in the Middle Ages, but definitely since the early modern period, Jewish literature was censored, right? Whenever there is a hostile expression towards Christianity, this was simply omitted, deleted from Jewish literature.
The books were censored, self-censored, and externally censored.
Exactly.
Yeah, no doubt.
And therefore, even that, now there's no censorship. So things come up, things surface. Also those things that you wanted to suppress, that you wanted to take out, and there's a big controversy. I mean, clearly...
Give me an example, be concrete.
Okay, Maimonides, for example, says quite harsh things about Jesus. He came, he distracted, right? He took the Jews off the right track and he misled them, but still he is paving the way for the kind of educating the world for the coming of the actual Messiah. So this Maimonidean text was completely omitted, right? Or when Maimonides can be very harsh with relation to Christianity, he was also with the Muslim philosophers that he was very much influenced by, and we see his anti-Christian polemic is very often related to Muslim anti-Christian polemic. And for him, Christianity was considered to be idolatry. We know that the Trinity was very difficult for him. So these things were censored. And now you can read them, right? Now they're accessible. There is no external eye that would say, okay, this part of Maimonides you're not going to read, you're not going to be acquainted with. And therefore, we see them also back into the discourse.
I will say, Karma, that you give a brilliant description of 50% of the issue, a complete description of 50% of the issue, in the sense that these Jews who studied this archaic text of Maimonides or whomever do not know anything about Christianity, but what is reflected through the ancient books. They have no clue that Christianity moved on.
They have no clue.
No clue. So they fight Middle Ages wars in the 21st century.
Right. They are the Christianity is an imagined Christianity. It's imagined through the worst stages in Jewish history where Christians were oppressors in the most significant way possible. Pius XII is not even there, right? It's really medieval. It's really going back to the Inquisition very often, to the medieval riots, to the 11th century. I mean, that's where
you say from your experience, this is about gossip, and you know that I love gossip, okay? That Christian learned people know more about contemporary Judaism that Jewish learned people know about contemporary Christianity?
I would like to say yes, but I want to say something in addition about that, because it's also due to the asymmetry in terms of the academia, because theology is part of the academia outside of Israel. But in terms of the Jewish world, there is Jewish religious learning, and academia is extremely secular here. So you don't have theology faculties. You don't have religious Jews learning Christianity. You have, I mean, some of my students are actually Orthodox and they really love Christian theology, which is a new thing, I think. But basically, structurally speaking, those who can learn about Christianity are secular, very often secular, and therefore their interest in deep religious questions is kind of weak from the outset, and therefore they may know things, but more about the sociology of Christianity, not about the theology.
All Christianity is the foundation for secular West. the
but this is
liberal, the
often
liberties and
denied.
freedoms, etc.
But this is often denied, right? Even when we learn in the university, we learn philosophy, so we will learn Descartes, for example, but we won't read his more Christian texts. We'll read read him as a secular figure.
What supports the argument of the academia?
Exactly.
Okay.
So this is kind of, it's very hard even to find one course that will properly teach Thomas Aquinas in the Israeli academia.
In a very, very strange way, when I was at the yeshiva, which is the religious academy at high school, we studied Thomas of Aquino.
That's amazing. Yeah. That's wonderful. It is quite
even
wonderful.
Even in Hebrew, it was Thomas ish Aquino.
Yeah,
That's
right.
Such an archaic Hebrew because the translation was archaic.
We also did it now, a seminar, a medievalist, Ayelet Even Ezra, who's translating the Summa to Hebrew.
Okay.
So we did a seminar together, and Thomas and his...
You mentioned Descartes. I have a podcast in Hebrew called Cogito. And it's Cogito ergo sum. And when people ask me, especially religious people, what is Cogito? I said, it's a good pizzeria in Rome. And we move on because they don't want to go into it.
Yeah, that's the problem of Latin. But Avraham, I have 2 points that I have to make before we move on. So one is just to wrap what we said, that secular Israelis, Jews, would be very open to dialogue with Christians, but with less interest in Christianity. While Orthodox Jews who have religious issues, right, they are interested, but they are much more hesitant and sometimes really don't want to get into dialogue. So the 2 big groups in Jewish Israeli society are out of the dialogue in this sense for different reasons. And this is one of the major obstacles, I think, that somehow has to be rethought or reconsidered in order for Israeli Jewry to get in dialogue with the church.
It's a fascinating point, but I think it's off the grid in the sense that we're in a connection with very little things that are happening to the West or to the universe in general. We're so much living inside our own shells.
Yeah.
And so it's not just that we are blind or deaf to Christianity. We are blind and deaf to many other things.
So that actually connects well to the other point I wanted to make. And this is about, you mentioned the harassments of Christians that are mostly in the old city of Jerusalem, but also in other places, which is really a grave phenomenon, a very difficult phenomenon, one that it is better in terms of how it's tackled by the law, by volunteers than it was before, but still it is a heavy problem. But I think as Israelis that really want to be self-reflective about our own problems, we often forget that Jews are also spat at all over the world, very often. And, these are phenomena that we have to somehow consider together.
So you mean it's a dialogue of saliva?
Exactly.
Saliva.
Exactly. So it's not, that the Jews are hostile to Christians, but, everybody are fine with the Jews.
Okay, let's move to nicer places, okay? I want to offer you a theory about why the dialogue doesn't work. At the past, you mentioned Middle Ages, we mentioned the Inquisition, we mentioned personalities. The polemics were enforced on Jews. Is it because the Christian wanted to win over and to show their own audiences, listen, it's Judean captiva. We are better than them. They are witnessing the greatest of the New Testament. And therefore, because polemics were enforced, the dialogue existed. Today, in the free world, there is no enforcement of polemics, and therefore there is no dialogue. Who cares?
Yeah, in a
Why
way.
is it important?
But there is a lot of polemic today.
Yeah, but it's tweet polemics. It's not heavy. Yeah,
it's not as profound as an intellectually deep the way it used to be, but I think the discourse is extremely polemical today, and it also has religious components, whether they are obvious and clear or they're more subvert. This is a question, but it's a different story. I wouldn't say that the dialogue is completely unsuccessful, and this is maybe a point where we should highlight also the extremely good achievements of Nostra Aetate and of the tradition that came after it, because you really do see, okay, today we have a crisis, it's difficult, everything is difficult today, but we see changes. We see communities rethinking their most profound traditions and moving very delicately the pieces of the puzzle in order to produce something else. Of course, it's imperfect. Of course, these are huge worlds that you want to influence. And it's very hard to do in these sort of communities and traditions that are so ancient. But this does happen, and many things did happen, and many possibilities for Jews and Christians. Even your own podcast, wouldn't be possible without Nostra Aetate. This podcast also happens in Israel, in Jerusalem, and we should also think about that. So it's not
I have to
one-sided.
correct you. It happens in the Holy Land.
Okay, fine. I mean, the name issue is very definitely
Terra Santa. Terra Santa.
Okay.
But listen, I want to challenge you for a second, okay? We said that ultra-Orthodox is not interested and very few are involved, and the majority of Israelis are, in a way, ignorant to what happens here. I'd like to offer you a counter-argument, counter myself. And there is a place in which there is a fascinating dialogue between Jews and Christians, and this is between the Israeli Jewish Messianic fundamentalists and the Christian evangelical Zionists in North America. That's a conversation and a dialogue that both Catholic and liberals must be envy.
When you say Messianic, I mean, Messianic Judaism can have several meanings. Do you want to say exactly to which communities are you referring now?
Within Jewish Orthodoxy in Israel, you have three main streams, notions. You have the ultra-Orthodoxy, the way we know it through outfit and behavior, etc. We have religious Zionism, and we have traditionalists. Let's leave traditionalists outside. Let's leave ultra-Orthodox aside and focus on religious Zionists.
Right, okay.
Others will call them the settlers or the greater land of Israel believers, but they are the people who fundamentally believe that the state of Israel is the dawn of our redemption. It's not a secular tool in the hands of the people, but it's a part of a process of eschatological process. And in a way, this is where they correspond with some Christian theologies that also see the ingathering in the Holy Land as part towards the end of the days. So these people.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. There is a very interesting dialogue that is going on there. When we say Messianic Judaism, often what we mean is to this community that calls itself Messianic, which means Jews who believe in Jesus. That's a different kind of Messianic Judaism.
Good correction.
And maybe we should say something about them as well, because that's another challenge to the institutional dialogue between Christians and Jews who do not believe in Jesus. But what you're calling Messianic Jews, let's call them for now radical religious Zionists, maybe not even radical, not always radical,
mainstream.
Right? But those who carve a place for the state of Israel,
those who pray every
Ulatan.
Saturday morning sermon, God in heaven, please bless the state of Israel, the dawn of our redemption.
Right. So I think even this is a too broad group, because you can say that and mean all kinds of things. But let's say those who really aspire also for the concrete building of the third temple. Okay, so we're talking about a specific group that really has an eschatological plan that sees concrete history as a milestone within an imminent eschatological plan. And this is parallel with what we see in the evangelical world. This is, again, it's a trend that is now getting a bit down, right?
Really?
Yes, it's important. So there was a huge peak after the Six-Day War, after 1967. Then you see really evangelical literature, film, especially American, United States evangelicalism, that is really very involved in this kind of eschatological project, and investing also in the settlements, in the educating towards the building of the temple. This was very strong, and it has actually very old roots in the 17th century, perhaps even before that. But it's not always so eschatological, right? So
really?
It's a big story and a complex one.
But nonetheless, there is a conversation there.
There is a conversation there.
Mutual support, mutual enrichment, mutual political projects.
Yes, absolutely. However, there is also, first of all, there is a divide within what you call eschatological religious Zionist Judaism, whether to get into dialogue and into conversation and into collaboration with evangelicals. Not all agree on that. Some see it as kind of that this is actually an instrumentalization of Jews and Judaism.
But here I'll interject and I'll ask you, who is using whom? Who wags whom?
Yeah.
Do the Israeli settlers use the Christian evangelical Zionists, or do these Messianic Christians use the settlers?
Yeah. So this is a good question. Maybe, and sometimes I think this is an open question, and it depends on who you're asking. But it's not only instrumental, it's not only external and cynical, even if they have eventually very different eschatological endpoints, right? So they don't aim to the same endpoint exactly. And still, there is also a real dialogue there. I mean, we may not like it for for obvious reasons, but there is profound theological dialogue there, dialogue that has to do with a very clear investment in Old Testament or in Hebrew Bible texts that is very common to both of these traditions, and to a kind of a literal or a concrete reading of these traditions within this place.
So now be my professional witness, okay? Help me. They have their own agenda, and we're not here to judge it politically. We just look at it and we describe it and we try to understand it through the prisms of our conversation. But why doesn't the opposite happen? Major parts of Catholic Church, not all of it, not its entirely, but are very peace-centered, because the Church does not have armies anymore. The Church does not have soldiers anymore, does not have a political aspiration anymore. It promotes different philosophy of reconciliation, of understanding, of compassion, through theology or through gestures. So why don't you see the Church involved much more in the peace efforts in our region? You saw it in Sudan, you saw it in Somalia, you saw it in Latin America, you even saw it in Poland at the time, but you don't see it here, at the cradle of Christianity.
Yeah, I actually thought that they're more involved. It's the first time I mean, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. It's
So
an interesting
don't.
question, but I want to remind you that it took hundreds, centuries for the Church to give up its political power.
Sure.
And
To get used to it.
And to get, exactly, it wasn't done willfully, right? Later on, in say in Vatican II, it has, of course, precedents in Christian literature during the wars, of course, and throughout the 20th century, from the 20s on. But still, Vatican II, you would say, I mean, this is the time when the Church says, okay, now this is the situation. We have to reinvent ourselves as a church that supports liberal democracy. It's really a revolution. I mean, it's even more than Nostra Aetate, right? This is incredible. It's incredible. And today we all see the Church as a power that kind of supports democracy, even though this is a theocracy. I want to remind you.
Yeah.
So this is something extremely interesting, the way that this took place, and the way that the Church began supporting the separation between church and state, even though it does have, historically speaking, without Christendom, you wouldn't even have the idea of separation between church. I mean, this is really a Catholic invention in the end. So it's a very complicated history, but this is something we should remember. I think that the question of how to relate to the Holy Land and also to the question of religion and politics is a major division today. It's a major problem within Jewish Catholic dialogue. And this is both because of this inclination of the Church towards liberal democracy and the challenges that now, I mean, for Judaism, it's, you know how it is. It's very complicated here in Israel, this relationship. That's an issue, but we should also remember that Catholic theology always mixed between religion and politics in relation to Jews. Because the question of the loss of Jewish sovereignty in the Holy Land was a central theme in anti-Jewish Catholic theology. And therefore, this is a baggage that is very hard to discharge in terms of the contemporary relationship.
I love to dive, but it's not our role, to the role of Catholic judges at the Supreme Court of the United States of America vis-a-vis the whole notion of the church supporting liberal democracies. But it's a fascinating topic by itself. But let's try to wrap our conversation with two kinds of questions. The first is, up until the Second World War, 90% of the Jews lived within the Christian hemisphere. And only 10% of the Jews, give or take, lived within the Muslim hemisphere. In the state of Israel, we're now 50-50. 50% Jews coming from the Muslim states and 50% are coming from the Christian hemisphere. This way or that way, imagine that the dialogue between Jews and Christians works. Everything is perfect. And there is peace the way President Trump and myself want in the region, okay? And now you have to consult the people, do the dialogue in the church. What will you give them as an answer? Can the Jewish people survive without an external adversary? Or do we need them?
Gladly, we don't. It's a very theoretical question.
Yeah, but I have the patience of the church. 2,000 years is for me short term.
Yeah. I would say that Jews cannot survive without a relationship with others, because Judaism has always consolidated itself also through this relationship. Many times it was quite a very difficult relationship, but not always, right?
It's not a dialogue, but it's action and reaction.
It's really a relationship. It's entangled. Judaism is entangled. And so it's not I wouldn't say that we desperately need an adversary. When we have adversaries, this definitely produces all kinds of Judaisms, right? Whether we like them or not. But in terms of a relationship, this is definitely essential for the Jewish tradition. We can't do without this encounter, whether this is a painful one or an enriching one.
Last but not least, try to look forward. Vatican III in 40 years' time will be focused around what?
I would say around the globalization of the church, of the transition from a long Western history of Catholicism to breaking new ground and to this reformulation of Christian culture. But I don't think there will be so soon a third council. I want to remind you that before Vatican I, there were centuries without nothing. So I wouldn't expect it to happen so quickly.
So maybe if we won't have Vatican III, we have Rabbinical I.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, for that.
Dr. Karma Ben Johanan, it's always a pleasure, always challenging, and I learned a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the exciting conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
It's a pleasure.
Jerusalem Talks is brought to you by the University of Notre Dame's Academic Center in Jerusalem and was made possible by the efforts of Avraham Burg, Daniel Schwacke, Gabriel Mitchell, David Turgeman, Ben Wallach, and Nathan Steinmeier. Learn more about us at jerusalem.nd.edu.